I'm Richard Holloway. He's Stuart Kelly. And this session is called The Minister and the Murderer. I'll let you guess who's who. I'm a minister. He's not quite a minister, so that, I think, identifies him. He's written an astonishing book. It's a deep, multi-layered book, The Minister and the Murderer, and it's about a man who killed his mother and then later on became a Church of Scotland minister. As befits a Christian writer, the book has a Trinitarian form. 3 consubstantial, co-equal parts. The first bit is actually about the minister who was the murderer, but it's also a history of the Kirk, the Church of Scotland in the 20th century. And I've often wanted such a book because it's been lacking. There's nothing really that brings the Church of Scotland up to date, and this book does. But the third bit of the book is about this man himself, because he brings himself into the book very honestly. And I wanted Stuart to maybe discuss the book on these 3 Trinitarian personalities, as it were. So tell us a bit about Nelson, and then lead up to the big debate that happened. You were prompted, in a sense, to get into it, because when the Kirk was discussing same-sex relationships and whether ministers could have them a few years ago, you were surprised to discover that none of them had heard about this extraordinary case only in 1984. So talk us through that.
It was remarkable because the newspapers in Scotland and south of the border were full of this story. The rough outline is that in 1969, as a rather young man, James Nelson came home. He was living with his parents again, and there was some kind of argument, and he took his grandfather's police truncheon, which was hanging on the wall. And you have to wonder about the kind of family that has a police truncheon hanging there as a kind of bibelot, and murdered his mother. And he confessed. He gave himself up to the police 2 days later and served 10 years in Saughton, HMP Edinburgh, then went to St Andrews to read theology, and then applied to presbytery to become a minister, to become a licentiate. So he wanted his license. It's quite funny that, when he left prison, of course, he was on license, and then he was going to be on license to become a minister. Presbytery rejected his application by 1 vote. And so he took it to the General Assembly to ask them to overturn Presbytery's decision. And there was a big debate with many of the major theological thinkers of the time arguing whether or not it was possible that somebody who'd committed this crime could actually take on full ministry and ordination. I thought it was a remarkable story, and I was really disappointed when I was saying I don't see any problem with ministers in same-sex relationships, given that we've already ordained a murderer. I think that's slightly more morally culpable in the scheme of things. And everyone had forgotten about it. And in a way, part of the story is he does a kind of almost Patricia Highsmith-style disappearing trick. It's like the dog collar is Guy G's ring that makes you invisible. He suddenly became almost invisible. In fact, he says in one of the interviews that he gave, what he really liked was not being recognized in the bakers. This was the aspiration for him. So it is about that, and I think the church, rather in contrast to the way that the church is now, took this really seriously. When I was at the assembly for the debate on same-sex relationships, which I thought was fairly lacking in rigour, I sat through the interminable debates about ministers' pensions.
Nothing more important.
There was one debate cited on what contemporary neuroscience tells us about religion, which I thought, this will be fascinating. They'll really get their teeth into this. And it lasted all of 7 minutes. And in a way, I'm immensely nostalgic for the point when the Kirk... remember, this was broadcast on television. They treated it like Wimbledon, the General Assembly. I'm rather nostalgic for the days when the church wasn't just taken seriously, it took itself seriously.
Every debate in the General Assembly was recorded. There were TV. Mind you, it was before we got our own Parliament back, and in a sense,
Yes.
it doubled almost as a Scottish Parliament.
I think Andrew Marr makes this point in his History of Scotland, that
Yeah.
between 1707 and the restoration of the Scottish Parliament, the most democratic institution for discussing moral and political issues was the Church of Scotland's General Assembly. And we've forgotten that.
So why is the Kirk a bit eclipsed at the moment then? Because you seem to be saying there's a certain tone of mourning in what you're saying, that the church is no longer as significant a national institution as it used to be. I, as a mere Scottish Episcopalian, miss that. I actually miss the role of the Kirk, because it seemed to me to capture something of the Scottish temperament, the Scottish nation, and it seems somehow to be lurking in the shadows at the moment.
I think the church's biggest problem is wanting to be liked. It doesn't want to stand up for certain principles. I was recently at the Vocation Day for the Church of Scotland with the absolutely ghastly slogan, Church of Scotland Vocation Day, it's your call. And at the first session that I had to go to, the minister said, "What's at the centre of ministry?" And there's a kind of sea of blank faces, whereupon the person says, "You are." And I nearly stood up and said, "I've been labouring under the misapprehension that God was." But it was that kind of Americanized, corporate speak, PR speak, that seemed to be a profound sign of a lack of seriousness. And it's because they want to be liked. And let's face it, anyone who can go through life and never be disliked, never have some kind of conflict, is probably in some ways a coward.
Yeah. Let's visit another of the great themes in the book, which is the theme of forgiveness. I mean, it's central to Christianity's self-understanding. It's not always obviously practiced. Do you want us to read us anything about that, or do you just want to reflect? You've got lots of nice heady quotes from Derrida, from Kant, even from Jesus occasionally. So let's talk around that, because it is a big and profound issue, and I'm very interested in self-forgiveness.
Well, that would be an interesting thing to come on to, because Nelson said, "I've forgiven myself." And that strikes me as quite a difficult thing to say. One of the reasons that his story attracted me was he didn't do a kind of mea culpa, I'm the worst of sinners. There was no public admission of remorse. And that struck me as strange. But you've got to separate out the different kinds of things with forgiveness. That, there's exculpation, there's realizing that what you did wasn't actually wrong in the first place. So there's all these kind of varieties of it. It's very striking that in the classical world, the two great philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, never talk about forgiveness. Their ideal is somebody who is so morally perfect that A, they can't do anything that would require forgiveness, and they are so morally superior that they wouldn't need to feel harmed by anyone and require forgiveness from another. So it's a very strange concept. And I was thunderstruck by the fact that there is so little literature on forgiveness. I mean, you've written a book on forgiveness. It's a very, very good book.
A wee book, yeah.
Derrida has written on forgiveness. But, if you try and find contemporary, either theological or philosophical examinations of forgiveness, they're very few and far between. And it does raise very, very big questions. I mean, if somebody had, let's say, Alzheimer's and couldn't remember that they had done something wrong, what would forgiveness entail in that situation? If somebody point blank refused to be forgiven, and I always think that the point where Jesus says that the only thing which can't be forgiven is the sin against the Holy Ghost, that what that is the willful rejection of forgiveness.
or the failure to believe that you yourself need it.
Or indeed the failure to believe that you need it. I mean, it's one of the strangest things, because every single one of us will have A, done things which require us to be forgiven for doing, and B, will have had things done to us and require forgiveness as a way to get over the resentment, as Bishop Butler called it.
I like Hannah Arendt, who is a philosopher who wrote about forgiveness. I quite like her definition of forgiveness. She says that I'm a kind of semi-predestinarian. I believe that
I don't think you could be a semi-predestinarian.
I'm a semi-Calvinist in the sense that I believe that we're not as in charge of what we do as we think we are. That old Larkin got it. They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They do not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-time hats and coats who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man, hands on misery to man, it deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as quickly as you can, and don't have any kids yourself. So, in a sense that captures the human condition. And what Hannah Arendt says is that though we really don't know what we're doing when we're acting, we're doing all these terrible things, our actions have consequences. You can't delete the act, but what she seems to suggest is that you can maybe interrupt the consequences so that you don't necessarily go on punishing the irreversible act. And if you don't learn to interrupt the consequences, you have these endless feuds that go on in history. Political history is filled with it. And I love the thought that my sinful acts, the consequences, might lead to certain irreparable damages to relationships. But forgiveness interrupts that and stops it happening. Now, you say something, because you quote Kant as saying something similar.
Yes, I mean, Kant does have a similar idea that it's about sort of restitution. But it can't just be a complete abasement. You know, it can't be that you punch me in the face and I say, don't worry, I forgive you. And you say, great, I'll punch you again. And it can't be that you hold on to the resentment so much that there's never any progress forward. But, you know, Hegel, one of the other people that I write about, has a lovely phrase that I use a lot, that of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing may be made.
Yeah.
And forgiveness almost interrupts that as well. When you quoted Larkin there, I was remembering W.H. Auden, his great poem, Law Like Love, where he goes through all the different definitions of what law might be like. And he ends saying that he thinks it's like love. And the final two lines are, like love, it makes us weep. Like love, we seldom keep. And, you know, we all know, I mean, if Calvinism has one great virtue, it's admitting that we're all sinners, that we've all failed. And I find the kind of radical democracy that brings about truly inspiring. Simon Critchley, who's a very, very good contemporary philosopher and is an atheist and makes no bones about his atheism, has written a very good book on Christianity called The Impossible Demand. And he says that the great thing about Christianity is nobody's ever going to get it right. You know, we're predestined to fail at it. It's an impossible ethic. And that's, in a way, something quite liberating. You know that you're never going to tick off all the boxes. No.
Did Nelson forgive himself at the end of his life? Did he receive? I mean, was the great debate in 1980, was that an act of the Kirk's forgiveness towards him, or did they park the issue because they didn't think they had the power to do it?
Well, this is interesting, and why I think only the Church of Scotland, a church in the sort of Reformed tradition, was able to do this. In a way, Calvinists can be very like Jesuits in terms of their intellectual riddling of things. They didn't say, it's okay, you're forgiven. And it certainly wasn't the case that a priest said, you're forgiven, it's going to be at least 100 Hail Marys. What they said was, we do not have the right to say that you're not forgiven. You know, we don't know the mind of God. It may be that you're forgiven, it may be that you're not forgiven, but it's not up to us to say that you're definitely not forgiven. So it was a kind of brilliant Church of Scotland double negative. But I think it's theologically robust. You know, I mean, it's why there's a lovely story, which I didn't put in the book, that the Emperor Constantine, who brought the Roman Empire into Christianity, didn't get baptized until his deathbed. And part of that was there was so little time to do any sinning. You know, when you knew you were dying, you got baptized and you had a kind of clean slate.
That's actually quite a well-known phenomenon, but you've got to get the timing right.
You do have to get the time right. You don't want a kind of sudden rallying of the spirits.
Yeah. You'd really need to be computerized up. So, oh, this is the last moment. Come in, Father. Yeah.
But I mean, that's what your book, Waiting for the Last Bus, does so well, is talk about how we approach the one thing we know is going to happen, which is our own mortality. And you talk about self-forgiveness in that context. Can you talk a bit about the...
Yeah, I've sat at lots of deathbeds, and one of the things that's most impressed and moved me has been the expression of deep regret about a life maybe not very well lived and whose life has been completely well lived. The people who look back, the man whose affair broke his marriage, embittered his wife, and therefore he never knew his grandchildren. And lots of lives are scarred by these events. And I think we're all blundering our way through life very often in a sense. We don't know what we're doing when we're acting, but we do that. And without the ability to forgive, these horrible mistakes and accidents just pile up. And I've sat beside people at the end of their lives unable to forgive themselves, looking back with regret at a life that maybe wasn't perfectly lived. And one of the things that being a priest in the Catholic as opposed to the Calvinist tradition gives you is a formula almost for dealing with that. I mean, it was said that the best chaplains in World War I were the Roman Catholics, because out in no man's land, they crawled about in the mud and they heard the confessions of all these dying soldiers who were dying in a kind of agony, and they were able to say a word that put them at rest, a kind of word of forgiveness, a word of absolution. And that, I think, can bring colossal peace at the end. But I think that you don't necessarily have to confess to a priest. I mean, I've encouraged people, if they didn't believe in God, but they still were riddled with regret about a life not perfectly lived, learn to forgive themselves. And I would often quote Gerard Manley Hopkins, the great Jesuit poet, who was a man riddled with unease and depression and guilt. And he wrote a wonderful few lines: "My own heart let me more have pity on. Let me live to my sad self hereafter kind." And I think that we're in a world at the moment that needs a whole kind of tsunami of kindness, because we're tearing each other apart. And I think you can be self-kind. You can be kind to yourself. And it may be that the final act of forgiveness at the end of a long and blundering life is self-forgiveness. Because to go back to Larkin, none of us, I think, really knew. I mean, I'm very fond of something Updike said. We get to play, the hand was dealt, we get to play the hand, but we didn't deal the cards. And we've inherited a lot of faults and mistakes and flaws from the past. It's Calvin again, predestinarianism, and somehow understanding that the life you lived, you were not totally in charge of, but at the end you have to own it. And maybe you have to let, if it's only a bank of flowers at the foot of the garden, if it's not a priest or a minister, it could be your cat. Say, "Yeah, I fucked up, Jenny." And the cat will meow a wee forgiveness to you, and that might be all you need to die in peace. So I'm all for getting people to die in peace. I'm not that far away from myself.
No, I think you've got some time left. It's very interesting. I mean, I'd like you to read a bit from the book in a second, but when Nelson was dying, he became a minister and kind of disappeared, but got cancer and did speak to some ministers towards the end. I mean, they say that philosophy is the art of dying well. And when Nelson was speaking with, not his confessor precisely, they said, "Jim, why did you do it? You'll not die happily until you say why you did it." I mean, he said it was a moment of madness. He said it was because his mother had said something offensive about a young lady he was seeing. And on his deathbed, his remark was, "If you'd known my mother, you wouldn't need to ask." Can we hear that?
And the minister then made the sign of the cross and forgive.
Do you want to read about the dog? Because that's the bit that makes me cry.
Let me read you a bit from the last chapter, and then I'll get to that bit. I was phoned recently by someone who had been commissioned by a newspaper to write my obituary. There was a fact he wanted to check and couldn't find the answer to. Would I mind helping him? I was happy to, and it got me thinking about the important role obituaries can play in helping us prepare for death. We don't any of us know the date of our own death, and it's silly to think it has already been fixed by the omniscient registrar in the sky. But there is a date out there of which in the future they will say, that's the day you died. So in that sense, it is fixed, it lies ahead, it is waiting for you. There will be a notice in the newspaper announcing it, along with the time and place of the funeral. There may even be an obituary, a life in 500 words, with an old photograph that moves those who love you in a way they can't quite explain. Like the funeral address, the obituary is one of the arts of anamnesis. Anamnesis is an important theological word. It's the word in the New Testament that's used when you hear about the Last Supper, when it says, do this in remembrance of me, in anamnesin. And it doesn't mean look back, it means make present again, bring here, which is why we argue in theology about the nature of what the presence of Jesus is in the bread and the wine. And a good obituary, like a good funeral service, is an act of anamnesis. It brings the person back again before we release them into eternity. And it's a difficult art. Too many of them concentrate on listing achievements and successes, so they read like post-mortem petitions for an OBE. I hate those. I hate that. I want to feel the passion and sorrow of the person. I don't want to hear how many directorships he had. And it's usually a man. They all list these kind of great list of achievements. Not interested in that. I want to know his sorrow. I want to know his joy, the struggles he had. But just occasionally, something of the turmoil of a lived life will come through. And they're the ones I like, the ones I profit from. I'm not bothered about how many directorships they had or how many books they wrote and the prizes they won, but I do like to read about their struggles with sorrow or sex or religion. I like to hear how they played the hand life dealt them. I'm helped by the knowledge that behind the confident public face, the private face was sometimes streaked with tears. And then let me go to the bit at the end. What surprised me most about reading obituaries, and I read obituaries, it's almost the first thing I go to in the pages of the Scotsman every day. Now, who's gone? A lot of them are Church of Scotland ministers that I remember, so watch it, Stuart. But what has surprised me most about obituaries is that reading them as a regular discipline helps to reconcile me to my own death. They work like those meetings of substance abusers who help each other overcome their addictions by owning and sharing them. Reading obituaries encourages me to confess my own condition. I take my place in the wide circle in the waiting room and say to the others assembled there, "Good evening, my name is Richard and I suffer from a terminal disease called mortality. Like all of you in here tonight, I'm waiting for the last bus. It's strangely comforting." And I want now to go to the very end of the book, because I'd finished this book, and then something happened. And I emailed my editor and said, can I add a few paragraphs to the acknowledgements page? And one of the things that happens nowadays is the acknowledgements are at the back of the book. When we first started writing books, they were at the front. The acknowledgements are those long pages very often where you thank your Aunt Jessie and the librarian in the local library that put you onto things. Nowadays, they're at the back. His acknowledgement page is about 5 pages long. Mine is 1.5. And this is what I wrote at the very end. This was smuggled on to the final page of the book. My dog Daisy died as this book was going through the final stages of the copy editing process. She was 17 years old, and for every minute of those years, she was happiest when she was beside me. We walked thousands of miles together on the Pentland Hills till she was too old and tired to keep up. The first trek I took without her was on Good Friday 4 years ago. It seemed the right day for it, and I wept as I strode through the green cleuch without her wee body trotting behind me, close at my heels. Her final years were of peaceful decline, slower walks round the block, having to be carried upstairs, more visits to the vet, sleeping most of the time, though dogs have always been great at that anyway. We held her close as the kindly vet released her from what had become a painful disintegration. Given how old I am, she will not be replaced. Daisy was my last dog, and the years blow away like leaves in the wind. And that wee dog taught me a lot about how to mourn.
Richard, I'm going to forgive you because my acknowledgements is half a page, not a page and a half. No, it's a lovely part, that, and it is that sense of the terminal points that you sort of think through. There will be the last book that I read. There will be the last meal that I eat. There will be, and in a way, that sense of living as if each one is a much more.
Who was it? Was it Walter de la Mare who said, "Look thy last in all things lovely every day"?
Yes.
So live as though it will be the last time you see her.
Yes. But in terms of the sort of forgiveness, I mean, if you'd been confronted with the Nelson case, with somebody who seems unrepentant, you know, when we say in the Book of Common Order that forgiveness is there for every sinner who truly repents, I mean, is repentance necessary? Do you have to fess up?
There are two kinds of forgiveness, I think, in the New Testament. There is the kind of forgiveness that's based on owning up. I'm sorry I did that. Okay, I forgive you, and it's over. But this is one of the things that Derrida says in that book we both quote, is that the only real forgiveness is for the unforgivable. And I think that if there is that mystery we call God, I think that's the nature of that forgiveness. And I think you get that in Jesus. You get a kind of the parable of the prodigal son, which I quote and which you mention, when the father rushes out to meet the son who's returning from the things he's done, the lost life, the wasted years, he doesn't get a word out. He makes up a wee speech. I'll arise and go to my father and will say unto him, Father, I've sinned against you. I'm no longer worthy. And he doesn't get a word out before the father rushes to him and forgives him. And one of the theologians I read says that at that moment the son repented. It was only when he was unconditionally forgiven that he realized the kind of person he'd become. And I think that's the nature of real radical Christian forgiveness. The forgiveness that Jesus says comes from God. It understands totally the kind of life we've had, the messes we've made, and it rushes to meet us with love. And that's the moment when you really see what it is you've needed forgiveness for. So I think it can create penitence. Forgiveness comes before penitence in a funny kind of a way.
I think that's right. And what I've always been uncomfortable with in terms of discussions on forgiveness is the idea of conditionality. You know, if you're saying, okay, this person has done this, let's say, well, in Islam it's always restitution has been made. They've made restitution, they have shown that they are a different person, then you're not forgiving the person that committed the sin or the crime. You're forgiving the person they've become because they've set certain limits and lived up to them. And in a way, that sort of sense of conditionality was one of the things I wanted to get into the book about Nelson. I mean, you mentioned that it's a sort of Trinitarian structure between the Kirk, Nelson, and
We've
myself.
got to come to you in a minute.
Well,
Yeah.
that's just what I was going to say, that I felt I could only write about this man who committed something which we all acknowledge and realise was a heinous, heinous thing. But I could only do it if I was judging myself more harshly than any other person in the story, that I didn't have the moral authority to make a moral judgment. I call it sometimes an anti-biography. I slightly feel I've cheated every single reader because it sets up this whole thing about Nelson and forgiveness. And when you get to the end, I sort of say, in conclusion, I have no conclusions,
Yeah.
which is a bit of a cheat in some ways. But I think it's actually true. You know, if we were to dig up Nelson, well, actually he was cremated, so you couldn't, and, you know, run an MRI scan or look at his DNA, you still wouldn't know
No.
the story. And I met so many people, half of whom would say he was a terrible, arrogant, monstrous man, and some who'd say he was one of the best, kindest preachers we had. And I didn't want to do a book which neglected that horrible contradiction.
We're all mysteries to ourselves, really, which
Yes.
is why you have to have a kind of compassion towards the other. And I'm interested in the fact that you bring yourself into this book, partly in a confessional way, but partly also you give us, you know, the grace of your own struggles with all this big stuff, these big questions. Is there God? Is the church any good? Can it heal me? Can it give me grace? And you've kind of come right through that.
Yes.
You're now a Kirk elder.
Yes? Well, I've not been officially made an elder yet, but the invitation
but it-
has been
yeah,
made
yeah,
by the Kirk session that I become an elder.
So you're having to preach this gospel of radical forgiveness,
Yes. For a
even in
long
the
time,
borders.
where we can hold a grudge for centuries.
Yeah. Good luck. I hope you've got a bulletproof vest.
But, I mean, the arc of that part of the story is, I think, a very conventional one, and it's one that I think a lot of people that I know have gone through, being brought up in the church, being exposed to certain intellectual ideas when I was actually rather too young to be exposed to them. So I was reading Nietzsche, and I was reading Blake, and I was, you know, reading all sorts of philosophies, particularly atheist philosophies, and I became a very smug atheist. And it was just easier. It was much easier.
They're almost as bad as smug theists, aren't they?
Yes. And it was only when I gradually came back to church. I mean, I will quite happily admit that when I first started going back to church, it was a kind of fake it till you make it situation. I'd go along thinking, well, I don't really believe. But the more I went, the more I thought, yes. And I think the one thing that absolutely confirmed me is it was an Easter weekend, and I was thinking about the Easter narrative. And I was thinking, you know, when I was a smug atheist, we used to talk a lot about, well, oh, you know, the resurrection. Osiris was resurrected in ancient Egypt, and Baldur is resurrected in the Norse mythology, and Tammuz was resurrected. You know, it's just another one of these stories. And in the Bible, people are resurrected. So Elijah resurrects somebody, and Paul resurrects somebody, and Peter resurrects somebody. Of course, Jesus resurrects Lazarus. In every instance of these stories, there's a resurrector and there's a resurrectee. At the resurrection on Easter Sunday, he does it himself. It's self-resurrecting. And if nothing else, this is a new story in the world. And if there's a new story in the world, that's important. That's something that you need to take seriously. And the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to me this new story was something that I was never going to get out of the back of my head.
You see, yeah, I mean, I'm much more on the edge of Christianity than he is, because I've lost the capacity for certainty about anything, including the fact that God may not be there. And I like this kind of divine uncertainty. I think the resurrection probably was something that happened in the minds of the apostles, but I wouldn't try to prove that. I don't think you're doing that either. I think you're experiencing resurrection dynamic as the capacity for change. And what I kind of like about the church at the moment is that it's so weak. I like weak religions. I hate religions when they're strong because then they become tyrannous. One of the things happening to the great Roman Catholic Church, which I revere at the moment, is being weakened by all these horrible scandals. And it'll be more use to us when it's weakened, because it'll be more like the rest of us. It won't boss us around. And it may be that how we started, Stuart, with the Kirk being a weaker institution than it was, it may learn to be humbler, to be more alongside us than to be dominating us.
I think I agree with that. I mean, there's two things I'd mention in that context. There's a lovely line of the poet Robert Lowell. I mean, both our books are sort of full of poetry, but in our life studies, he says, "Sometimes in sickness we are weak enough to enter heaven," which I've always thought was a very comforting line. The other is just an anecdote of a friend. I'm friends with the novelist Nicola Barker, who, when you mention what's happening at the moment with the churches in Pennsylvania particularly, was at a prayer meeting and just burst into tears. She said, "We can't not acknowledge." You know, we're all going around sort of praying for the Women's Guild and praying for... I mean, she's Roman Catholic. She's Roman Catholic. I asked her once, why did you, when you came back to the church, go to Roman Catholicism? And she said, "Well, Stuart, it's because I'm a feminist, I support gay marriage, and I detest the patriarchy." I think what I said was, okay, let's take this in little steps now.
She was up for a fight, clearly. Yeah.
But, you know, it was, she said, that's what I want to pray for. You know, if there's, I mean, in a way, it was one of the thought experiments that I put throughout the book, that, you know, Nelson had committed a murder. He'd murdered his mother. His chances of recidivism are precisely zero, not having any other mothers of his own to kill. And so in some ways, it's a moral, it's quite an easy out morally. So you can say, yes, and I was particularly taken with the fact that the parish that eventually chose him was a new town. So it'd be people who'd been in the slums in Glasgow, who'd gone to these shining new buildings. They'd all been given a second chance. And so they gave him a second chance. But then if you turn it into a different kind of crime, at the same time as Nelson's candidature was debated, there was an embezzler who wanted to become a minister. Now, embezzlement implies forethought. It's something you could easily do again, and you're putting the person in charge of quite large funds. And with my own church, I was saying, you know, how would we feel if somebody who was a convicted paedophile was to become our minister? You know, it's a very visceral feeling. And I think it would take a huge amount of moral courage, even just to wrestle with that question. Particularly because there is the chance it can happen again. I mean, when we had our, as we always called it, the quinquennial visitation, and the first question was, what's good about your church? And everyone said, oh, we're so welcoming. We're so welcoming. Now, in the village where I now live, they've just discovered that somebody does have a conviction for child abuse. And part of me thinks, how welcoming would we really be if that man came to the church and said, I've done this dreadful thing, it's broken me, it's lost me everything. What would we say? And I don't know the answer.
But it's maybe not a bad place for us to stop and give them a wee chance to ask some questions. I think we've got about, I think we're out of here at 10 to. I think we can maybe steal a few bits. There's a wandering mic. Anyone want to? Yep, there's a hand there. Yep.
I just wanted to point out that in the story of the prodigal son, the father welcomed him. He didn't say, I forgive you. He just welcomed him. And it's the same story with Joseph and his brethren. If you read Genesis, he says, who am I to take the role of God? He just welcomed his brethren. He didn't forgive them. And I think this is an important message about forgiveness, that we move on, that we don't think, you've done wrong, I forgive you. Let's see what we can do better in the future to make life more wonderful.
Okay, thank you. I think
And it
we'll
is-
leave that there.
It is the great point where Jesus is asked by Peter, how often do I forgive? And he says 7 times, and Jesus replies, no, 70 times 7, which is a Hebraic expression for infinitely, for forever. It is important. I have to say, I always had a terrible sympathy for the prodigal son's older brother.
Because he was an elder in the kirk, that's why.
Well, indeed, indeed. But you never killed the fatted calf for me. I thought there's a number of times I've said that.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yes?
Give me a moment to gather my thoughts. Yes, it's about forgiveness, and I am most definitely not a Christian, but spirituality has been really important to me in my life. I've also been a psychotherapist and worked with people. Got to know quite well several people who've murdered people. And there's something about I wouldn't even just say Christian, but Western take on forgiveness that has a righteousness in it that sticks in my gullet and a kind of entitlement. And if we think of this Nelson man, I didn't know about him. I'm furious with his mother. I don't know anything about the woman. But for him to be the one that is expected to be forgiven, it sounds to me like she broke his soul. So the whole, and I've worked with people who've been told that they ought to be forgiving by various people, and really struggled, particularly people who've been sexually abused as children, perhaps by nuns. I think in my experience, it's been essential that they get in touch with their outrage.
Yep.
And then what I've worked with myself on my transgressions, I hate these Christian words, but anyway, you know what I mean. My fucked upness, my mistakes, my clumsiness, my spite, is to try and understand and soften my heart. So to me, if we can understand ourselves and the other, and if we can also keep our hearts open. And in the old idea of forgiveness, there's a kind of entitlement to bitterness, which doesn't do anyone any good, least of all the person who's been transgressed against, as it were.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm asking a question, I just had to say all of that.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, when my wee book on forgiveness was published, and I went round the way authors do, and I remember doing an event in a library in Perth, and there were a row of women in the front row, and they all said it was our refusal to forgive that gave us back our authority. They were all from abusive relationships. And I think that it's important to the trouble with saying anything, you almost have to say its opposite in order to get the truth. One of the things that Desmond Tutu and Mandela understood was that South Africa, had to express its outrage and horror at the years of apartheid before letting them go. So maybe a better word for forgiveness is letting go. It's so that your past doesn't trap you. One of the horrible things about not being able to forgive is that it can lock you into the past you were offended against. This is what happens to lots of people who've been abused. They don't have a future, they only have a past. And to me, what forgiveness is letting go so that you can take hold of the future of your own life. And whether you Christianize it or not, I think without that, you're locked.
I think there is a problem that some of our conventional thoughts about forgiveness is a kind of the haut en basse thing, that it's the big daddy saying, yes, I grant you this forgiveness, I bequeath you this forgiveness. I don't see it like that at all. And I think one has to separate quite distinctly within the Christian tradition the forgiveness and grace of God from what we do interpersonally with other people. Now, as I say, we've all done things that we require forgiveness for, and we've all had things done to us that we should be forgiven for. So, to that extent, it's what I said beforehand, the radical democracy of it is really important. Bishop Butler, who is one of the only people that's written about this with any seriousness, talked about it as what he thought forgiveness was about was not so much the other person. It wasn't, a kind of, I forgive you, therefore, it's okay for you. It was about the person who had been offended against. It was about them being able to let go of resentment, was the word that he used. And that forgiving actually was operating on the soul of the one who had been harmed, more than the person that done the harm.
Yeah. I think I don't know how much time, are you wanting us out? Can we take one more? Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So we wittered on too long.
I think it's just a brief follow-on to the previous comment. I have a feeling there's a kind of a slight tension between forgiveness, which is a kind of action, and what I would kind of dwell more in importance-wise is compassion. So actually having the feeling of compassion, which for me kind of comes before any overt or any kind of act of forgiveness. Because I know that if I kind of feel my heart open to my own pain or someone else's pain, there's no issue of forgiveness. You just feel that where that other person has come from and accept that's how things have happened, whatever has happened.
That's a great note to end on.
Indeed.
Okay. Yeah.
You've made me think profoundly about my own situation in Northern Ireland, where we're going through this process at the moment. And we've worked both with President Mandela and Bishop Tutu, but it's a very different culture, as you well know. So at the minute, we've reached a point where we're almost about to go into a process of truth-telling. Now, here is the question. How do you hold somebody accountable as a result of the truth-telling? Is the truth enough? And so what I have discovered in my life and working in this area of conflict resolution in Northern Ireland is every victim is different. Yeah. And every victim wants something different. And you've been talking about it on a one-to-one personal level. Yeah. Where I'm working is on a much more collective level. Yeah. So we can't take everybody to court, and many of these things happened 40 years ago. The DNA is corrupted and forensic evidence is interrupted. So no matter how many of them want prosecution, they're not going to get it. And anyway, we've filled our prisons in the past, 30,000 prisoners. So some of them will never have gone. And so the question now is, retributive justice didn't work, or maybe had its place, and certainly many were held accountable. And so the big issue, and it's a lot of bitterness is going on at the minute, about whether the state and the British Army, etc., should be held to account in a different way than non-state actors, IRA, etc. All those questions about accountability. But my question for you is about restorative justice and the importance of forgiveness in relation to that at a collective level, not just in her heart personally, but for a society that has suffered so much. So I don't know if you've ever wrestled with that, but in terms of how do we come from the place we were in to the place we want to be in restoring back to a country in a way that no longer hurts and harms.
There are cultures where restorative justice is very important. I mean, it's very important in the Maori community in New Zealand, this idea that you own what you did and you're face-to-face with the person you offended, and it's all part of the healing. We haven't been able to build that into our justice processes in this country yet. There are elements of it happening, but it would be profoundly important in the situation that you described, and I'm very grateful to you for doing it. It was what Tutu and Mandela were up against, and the premise on which the peace and justice reconciliation process was operating was that they had to own the reality of what they'd done, and only on that basis could they move on. Infinitely complex. I mean, the kind of political ramifications, the consequences of all this stuff are colossal, and I think that there are so many areas in which it's managed so badly, especially by politicians.
I think the difference between the punitive and the restorative is very important, but in a way the word restorative justice carries within it something which makes me not uncomfortable, but it's not resetting things to some thing in the past. It's actually about building a future which is unthinkable in the present. And I think that's extremely important, particularly for Northern Ireland. You know, there was never a point, you know, you're not going to go back to before the Ulster settlement under James VI and First. And you don't want to go back to a point where, you know, certain social mores were deemed appropriate. It's about building a better future. And in a way, that's one thing that the Nelson story told me was, in a very quiet way, what he did was build a better future for himself and for his parishioners. There are still people who, I met somebody at an event not so long ago who just said, oh, he buried my grandmother and he was really nice to me. And I thought, that's a tiny bit of goodness in a very dark world.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.